The shadow at Willow Creek Run Away. Enjoy this spooky story. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she ran through the thick forest, branches whipping her face and snagging at her clothes. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting the woods in a murky, disorienting darkness. She could still hear her stepfather's voice echoing behind her, faint but unmistakable, calling her name with a terrifying calmness. She had to keep running. She had no choice. Life at home had become unbearable since her mother remarried. Her stepfather, David, was cold, controlling, and kept secrets locked in their house like it was a prison. But it was the bruises on her mother's arms, the fearful glances, and the strange things Emily would hear in the night that made her decide she had to leave. So she fled, under the cover of night, with nothing but a small backpack and the conviction that anything was better than staying. Emily knew the woods well. They surrounded her small hometown of Willow Creek, sprawling endlessly, and as a child, she had spent hours playing there. But tonight they felt different. Ominous. The wind whispered through the trees like a voice she couldn't quite understand. The deeper she ran, the more the feeling of being followed clung to her skin like damp mist. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She slowed her pace and pulled it out. The screen lit up with a message from her best friend, Kelly. "Kelly, where are you?" "Call me, Ems." Emily's hands shook as she typed back. "Emily, I'm gone. I can't stay. I'll explain later." Just as she hit send, she heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate, heavy. But they weren't coming from behind her this time. They were ahead. She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. A dark figure stepped into the clearing. It was David. "You shouldn't have run, Emily," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You belong at home." Her legs felt like lead, her instincts screaming at her to move, but she was rooted to the spot. Then, as David took a step closer, the air around them changed. The temperature dropped, the wind stilled, and a distant, otherworldly howl echoed through the trees. Something else was in the woods with them. David's eyes flicked over his shoulder, suddenly wary. The confident look on his face faltered. For the first time, Emily saw fear in him, and then the shadows behind him began to shift. Without warning, a tall, shapeless shadow slithered out from between the trees. It moved unnaturally, like smoke but with purpose. David's head snapped around, and for the first time in all her years of knowing him, Emily saw pure terror in his eyes. "Run, Emily," David growled, his voice shaking as he backed away from the thing in the woods. Emily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted into the thickest part of the forest. The sounds of the shadow's movement, almost like whispering but deeper, followed behind her. She risked a glance back and saw David frozen, staring as the dark shape circled around him. But then she couldn't see anymore. The trees grew denser, the branches thicker, and the world became a blur of movement. She stumbled over roots, her foot caught in the undergrowth, and she fell hard onto the ground. Her phone slipped from her pocket, the screen cracked as it hit a rock. Emily groaned, trying to push herself up, but her ankle throbbed with pain. She gasped for breath, panic threatening to take over, but a voice in her mind screamed at her to move. Above her, the moon emerged from the clouds for a split second, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing just at the edge of her vision was the shadow. It wasn't like any shadow she had ever seen. It had a form, a twisted, towering figure with no face and arms that stretched unnaturally long, its fingers like claws. It stood silently, staring, if something without eyes could stare, directly at her. Emily's heart pounded in her throat as she scrambled backward on the ground, desperate to get away. The shadow didn't move, didn't chase her. It just watched. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees. Emily limped through the woods for what felt like hours, her ankle aching with each step. The night grew colder, and the woods seemed to close in around her. Every noise, every snap of a twig made her jump. The shadow was out there, somewhere waiting. In the distance, through the tangled branches, she saw a faint light. A cabin. She hurried toward it, ignoring the pain in her leg. The cabin was small, worn down, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But the light inside was warm, a flickering glow that promised safety. Emily pounded on the door, praying someone would answer. To her surprise, it creaked open almost immediately, and a frail-looking old woman stood in the doorway. Her eyes were cloudy, and her face was drawn with age, but she smiled kindly at Emily. "Come in, dear," the woman said softly. "You look like you've been running from something." Emily hesitated, glancing behind her into the dark woods. She didn't have a choice. She stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and safety the cabin seemed to offer. The old woman led her to a chair by the fire, handing her a cup of something warm and sweet-smelling. Emily took it, feeling the heat soothe her shaking hands. "Thank you," Emily whispered, still on edge. I don't know how to explain it, but something's been following me. A shadow." The old woman's face grew serious. She sat down across from Emily, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "This forest has old secrets, child. You're not the first to be chased by the darkness here." Emily's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The old woman sighed, her fingers tapping the armrest of her chair. "There is something ancient that lives in these woods. It takes what it wants. And once it set its eyes on you, there's little you can do to escape." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "What is it?" The old woman's voice lowered, barely above a whisper. "A spirit of vengeance. It comes for those who have wronged others, those who carry darkness in their hearts." Emily shook her head, confused. "But I didn't do anything wrong." The old woman's eyes sharpened. "Are you sure? Or is there something you're running from? Something you haven't faced?" The weight of the woman's words pressed on Emily's mind. The truth was, she was running from something. Not just David, but the guilt she'd carried since the accident. It had happened a year ago. Emily, Kelly, and their friend Nathan had been driving late at night. She had been the one behind the wheel, and in a moment of distraction, she lost control. Nathan hadn't survived. Since then, Emily had buried the memory deep, trying to forget. But the weight of it followed her everywhere. She didn't know if it was her fault. Not entirely, but that night had haunted her every moment since. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about Nathan, about how she had never really forgiven herself. Was that why the shadow was after her? Was she being punished for her guilt? The old woman watched her closely, as if she could read Emily's thoughts. You cannot run the past forever, child. Sometimes, you have to face it. Suddenly, the door of the cabin creaked open. The wind howled through the small room, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Emily's heart jumped into her throat as she saw the figure in the doorway. It wasn't David. It was the shadow. The old woman stood slowly, her expression grim. It's here. Emily stood too, her body trembling. She backed away as the shadow entered the room, its form towering and dark, absorbing the light around it. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear it created. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in feelings, an overwhelming flood of guilt, regret, and sorrow. Emily felt it wash over her, pulling her under like a wave. She saw Nathan's face, his laugh, the moment of the crash. Her knees buckled as she sobbed, the weight of everything she had been hiding crashing down on her. The shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating. I'm sorry, Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. For a moment, everything was silent. The shadow paused, as if listening. And then, slowly, it began to recede, melting into the corners of the room like mist. The suffocating pressure lifted, and Emily gasped for breath. The old woman watched as the shadow disappeared. It wanted your truth, child. Now you've given it. Emily sat on the floor, her whole body shaking, but for the first time in a year, she felt lighter. The shadow was gone, but the memory remained. Emily left the cabin at dawn, her ankles still sore but her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She didn't know what the future held or what would happen when she returned to town, but she knew one thing. She couldn't run from her past anymore. As she walked back through the forest, the morning light filtering through the trees, she glanced back one last time. In the distance, she thought she saw the shadow, just a faint wisp disappearing into the trees. But it didn't scare her anymore. It was a part of her now, a reminder that some shadows aren't meant to be outrun, they're meant to be faced.